What's funny was that, so I said that we did a book release party at the Apple Orchard in upstate New York. And when the owner of the orchard introduced me, he said, I've read this book and I think I figured it out. Mr. Brown has been struggling with alcohol his whole life, and he wrote this book. And everybody relatives of mine know that I've been like a teetotaler my whole life, and they all started laughing. He had no idea why they were laughing and then I patted him on the back and I said, "That's a really interesting theory," And
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast Homespun Script. I'm your host, Nate Knispel. Our guest today is Philip Raymond Brown, author of the novel It Gives You Strength. Published in 2021, the novel tells the story of Tashin Zhou, an alien anthropologist who is sent on a rescue mission to Earth to retrieve a lost child. Set in upstate New York during the height of prohibition, It Gives You Strength is a wonderful blend of science fiction and historical fiction. It Gives You Strength is quite the page-turner and does not disappoint. Phil, do you prefer Phil or Philip?
Phil is fine. Thanks, Nate.
Phil? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the time you're taking out of your schedule. It's a privilege to talk with you.
It's my pleasure.
Let me say that again. It's a pleasure and privilege to talk with you.
Well, it is my pleasure as well. Thank you, Nate.
Okay, great. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. I am a dad. I have 4 children, aged 12 to 20. I live in Colorado with my fabulous wife, Dr. Sarah Brown, and our kids are 2 really good dogs. And I was a trial lawyer for 35 years. I retired from the practice of law in 2015 and decided that I would write fiction. And this is my second career, writing fiction. I'm now working on my 3rd book. I've written 1 screenplay and 1 play, and I'm enjoying my retirement.
Wonderful. So what do you find more stressful, being a writer or being a trial lawyer?
Oh my gosh, it is not. Being a trial lawyer is stressful. Being a writer is a joy.
Okay. I was hoping that would be the answer, and I kind of expected it. So today this is your first novel, It Gives You Strength. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Tell me how it came to be.
All right. So we moved to Colorado in 2015 to this wonderful, idyllic little town. We had lived in Honolulu, Hawaii for 25 years. And Honolulu, Hawaii is a major, major city. And people think of it as this wonderful beach town, and it is a wonderful beach town. But to live in Honolulu, Hawaii, the way that I and my wife did, you have to work all the time, and that's what we did. So we just 7-8 years ago talked about it a lot and decided, we'd rather watch our children grow up and spend time with them. So we found this great little town in southern Colorado. We moved here. My wife is a full-time doctor. I am a stay-at-home dad, and while the kids are at school, I write. And it's been so your question was, how did I end up with this prohibition novel? Mm-hmm. My grandfather, the character in the novel, Mike Kelly, was based on the stories that I heard through the years about my grandfather, who was a bootlegger in upstate New York during Prohibition.
Oh, okay.
Now, I must totally confess that Mike Kelly is a far more exciting character in the book than the stories I heard about my grandfather growing up. The similarity is that just as Mike Kelly was a revered figure to his family in It Gives You Strength, Mike Minogue, my grandfather, was a revered figure in my family growing up. And when my mom and aunts and uncles would speak of him, it was almost like they were talking about a Kennedy, and
Mm-hmm. Oh.
and he was a bootlegger. So
Mm-hmm.
that was why I thought, well, that's an interesting take. To on the one hand, he mixes with gangsters
Mm-hmm.
and real life bootleggers, and on the other hand, his family reveres him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a fascinating time in American history. And how did you found yourself gravitating toward that context specifically, mainly due to your grandfather's history and the stories he told?
Well, and just my own interest. I was a history major
Mm-hmm.
in college. I, like so many history majors, I realized graduating college there's not a lot of jobs for people who studied history. So I ended up going to law school, and I had a whole career as a lawyer. But my great life interest was history, and so when I decided I was going to write something, I thought, well, this is my first book. I know upstate New York. I grew up there. I've heard all these stories about bootlegging. I can now do I can do historical research on the period, on the
Mm-hmm.
area, and then I'll build my characters around that research.
Mm-hmm. So, some of the topics that you deal with, it's not just factual history that you're dealing with, but a lot of maybe, shall I say, some of the unstated things that happened, especially during that time. And the one thing that hit me in that community, there are so many war veterans from World War One, and not only a lot of them, but many of them are from the same unit. And one thing I think you hit on this indirectly a few times and throughout the novel, but sort of the generational and communal trauma that was inflicted by World War One and the related mental health issues that were associated with that. And maybe if you could just talk a little bit about that and how you wove that into the story.
Sure, that's a great question, and let me try to do it justice. First, in chapter one and chapter two is the first time I address the sound. One of the things that we don't think about when with World War One, we think of men in trenches firing at each other, but the
Mm-hmm.
first time we had explosives that were as powerful as they were was World War One, and we were dropping bombs from planes, and the trauma that was inflicted on our soldiers and the soldiers from the other side and our allies was not just the fact that they could get their bodies blown apart, but it was the sound of
Mm-hmm.
the explosions around them would cause horrible trauma. Um, Now, one of the things that eased that trauma a little bit was that at least the American troops were sent in regional battalions. So you did have your friends with you
Oh,
in,
okay.
yeah. So I believe from upstate New York, they were called the apple toppers because in upstate New York, you have a lot of apple orchards. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, I did not address the apple orchards in It Gives You Strength, although one of the book launching parties that we had in upstate New York back
Mm-hmm.
in 2021 was in a big apple orchard.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Because
that's
for that,
appropriate. Yeah.
yes, for that very reason. Um, but what happened that is you had all these young men go off to the war where they were treated with they had great freedom. They
Mm-hmm.
risked their lives. They came home, and the government then took away their right to drink and told them, and just as in all of our military units, in all of our wars,
Mm-hmm.
there were various substances used to dull the trauma that soldiers were having
Mm-hmm.
inflicted on them. So in World War One, people drank a lot, and then they got
Mm-hmm.
home, and the government said to them, "Well, while you were gone, or while you were recovering, we decided that it would be illegal to sell alcohol." Um, and that didn't go over very
I bet
well.
it didn't. Yeah.
Yes. So that's why you see in the Mike Kelly's gang and this is my, you know, fictional creation,
Hmm.
his gang in the book is made primarily of World War I veterans.
Hmm.
So I hope
Yeah.
I answered your question.
Yeah, yeah, well, definitely. And also, I think at one point, Mike Kelly says, well, look, this is the family business. Essentially, before prohibition, we were importer exporters, and whiskey and beer made in Canada was our livelihood. And all of a sudden, I mean, World War One ended in 1918 or something like that. And we come back, and all of a sudden, our entire
Yes.
livelihood is cut from beneath us. Yeah.
And there's actually, I mentioned that my grandfather was a bootlegger, and
Hmm.
much of, and he actually passed before I was born. So much of my ideas for this book was based on family lore passed down from my aunts and uncles and mother, but
Hmm.
also various photographs that were taken. And one of the way I got the idea from that section that you just addressed was
Hmm.
that on one of my family's trucks, a photo of my family's trucks, it said business established in 1866. And I
Oh,
thought,
yeah.
wow. So
Hmm.
they started that business the year after the Civil War ended. And
Hmm.
then in 1919, the government effectively said, you can no longer operate your business. And
Hmm.
when we look back on prohibition, I don't think any of us can say that it wasn't a well-intended government program.
Hmm.
Clearly, the government was trying to protect all of our ancestors from the harms of alcohol. But like
Hmm.
so many well-intended government programs,
Hmm.
it had unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And right now in our country, I think we all can agree that our country is so fractured, it's difficult to get everyone to agree on anything. But
Hmm.
one thing we can all agree on, prohibition was a pretty stupid idea.
It didn't work out so well, did it? Yeah. And I mean, there were so many other things that were factored into it, and the rationale. It's not only that it's politically illegal well, back then it was politically illegal to transport alcohol, but that doesn't really affect the way general life operates within the town, though, because everyone's drinking there,
Right.
and the authorities look the other way for the most part. So, and I like the fact that whenever anyone calls Mike Kelly a bootlegger, he gets really ticked off, and he's like,
Yeah.
"No, this is I'm still doing the same thing that my family has been doing for it would have been 60 years, right? Since
Right.
1860, yeah."
Right.
And said, "No,
Yeah.
if you call me a bootlegger, there's a stigma with that, and that's insulting."
That's right. And my family has still been in that business up until now.
Mm-hmm.
That and so when it was uh, uh, in what 1933 when prohibition ended, my family
Mm-hmm.
just went back into the legitimate uh, alcohol distribution business.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they're
And
no longer bootleggers; they're distributors.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And it didn't seem, yeah, this is one thing that was really interesting about the novel. Well, several things were very interesting
Well,
in the
thank you.
novel. And this was definitely one of them because I had normally been familiar with this idea of bootlegging through, the history with NASCAR and in the South. Along those lines, I had no idea it was a thing in New York State and especially upstate. And with the Canadian border, it all makes perfect sense. But the logistics of the rum running, how did you go about doing research for that? Because the
It's
logistics are complicated, they're interesting, and I'm really curious how you went about doing that.
Well, that's one of the things that I've taken great joy in, actually, is if you start, I'm going to say for the record, the internet is a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you put in you know, Prohibition, Upstate New York. All these books come out. All these articles come out. Um, Lake Champlain, which most people who aren't from upstate New York don't even realize is a giant lake that stretches from central New York into Canada. So if you are, say, interested in getting rum from Canada down to New York City, that lake is just a wonderful source. And you can put rum on a vessel and ship it down to, and in the book, Whitehall is the town that I chose. And it wasn't that I just chose it at random. It was, it's where Lake Champlain meets the Hudson River. And then the Hudson River, you can actually sail of another vessel from Whitehall down into New York City, all the way into New York. And I actually read a book about and I think I used the actual character. There was a man who actually decided he was going to stop the flow of alcohol on Lake Champlain.
Oh.
And he and his wife and a couple college students would go out on their little tiny Chris Craft boat and try to stop all of these bootleggers who were shipping alcohol in from Canada and running it on Lake Champlain.
Oh. Okay, yeah, this is the guy who tries to board the ship
and Kelly laughed at him with his
time.
machine gun. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's and then they turn out to have actually known each other from serving in World War I together.
Yeah.
So
that was one of my favorite scenes in the book. The whole process of moving things around in Lake Champlain. And it's a testament to the fact that back in the early 20th century, before things like the internet and developed bureaucratic accountability measures were in place, you could have a military uniform and just kind of say a whole bunch of stuff with utter confidence and just make things happen, because he just goes out there and says, we're conducting exercises.
And then I have, this is just my fictional creation, but Kelly, what is a historical fact is that New York created a state National Guard unit called the New York Naval Militia, where they, and to this day, they have a New York Naval Militia.
No kidding.
Where they spend millions training New Yorkers in the event that the United States Navy needs extra sailors. And it's an example of a government program that may have been incredibly well intended at some point, that no longer be necessary. I gotta believe our U.S. Navy has enough sailors. I'm no expert on that, but and then I take that and fictionally, the bootleggers. I believe in the book I got Mike Kelly. Mike Kelly got himself appointed to be the head of the New York Naval Militia, and then he used that route to bring in more rum from Canada.
Yeah. He just went in and said, "I am the head of the Naval Militia," and just said it with his uniform and said it with utter confidence. And it's like, okay, yep, sure. He looks the part.
Yeah,
that really cracked me up.
He's a hero.
Yeah, a highly charismatic guy if he can pull that off. But yeah, that was great. The other thing that I found really interesting in terms of the historical research you did was on the Craig Colony, which is a real institution, and the head of the Craig Colony, or founder, I'm not sure what's the founder, but he was a real person as well, right?
He was. Yes. When I read, there are certain atrocities in American history that we all agree upon. What was done to the Indians, what was done during slavery. And so in researching this book, I stumbled on the Craig Colony. And then I started reading about the Craig Colony. And I almost stopped doing fiction. I thought I've got to. The lawyer in me came up, and I thought I
Oh.
have to write, some serious research. And then I thought, but no, Phil, this is your retirement. Weave it
Mhm.
into the fiction of the book.
Mhm.
But I did promise myself that every time I was on anything like this, I would say, Google the Craig colony, read about the
Mhm.
Craig colony. It is an atrocity that
Mhm.
people, mostly poor people with epilepsy, who
Mhm.
had seizures, and the poor people who couldn't afford um, really good medical care, then
Mhm.
had their children and sometimes adults put in what amounted to a prison south of Rochester, New York, being
Mhm.
told that, well, we have the uh, Craig Colony Care Program. We'll
Yeah.
implement the care program. And all the care program was, you did a lot of exercises. And if you did enough exercises, you'd be too tired to have a seizure.
Mhm.
There was no medical basis for that.
Mhm.
And that colony actually existed from, I mean, it wasn't a colony, it was a jail, but
Yeah.
they called it a colony. It existed from, I believe, 1894 until 1968 when it finally closed. There were
Oh, that's
similar,
surprising. Yeah.
yeah, there were similar colonies in Ohio, in
Mhm.
Texas, and in Virginia. And in Virginia, they actually got the United States Supreme Court to say that it would be all right for them to sterilize a woman with epilepsy.
Hmm.
It was a huge example of why eugenics, which was so popular in the
Yeah.
20s and 30s, and I think
Mhm.
after we saw the horrors that Hitler visited on the
Mhm.
people of Europe
Mhm.
under the name of eugenics.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm on my soapbox here, but the point being that more people should know that this type of quote unquote medical science went on inside the United States and has been
Mhm.
somehow swept under the rug, when we should be pointing to it as another one of the great historical
Mhm.
travesties.
Yeah. One thing that you said in there made me realize a couple of things, but the method of treatment that they use is work harder, keep yourself busy. And in one sense, sure, they're essentially using the inmates there, or the patient, quote unquote, patients there, for cheap labor. And that much was
They were,
obvious. Yeah.
yes, and
And
the pride they had when they finally were able to, uh, all of the things in the book that I quote were actual. Um, I actually read they would report to the New York legislature every year on the
mhm.
number of bricks that they had made and
Oh
sold,
my, yeah.
and
Hmm.
the doctors who worked at the Craig Colony actually lobbied the New York State legislature. I believe it was in 1915 and 16.
Hmm.
They wanted it illegal for epileptics to have children in New York State, and that
Yeah.
and it so in any event, as you saw in it, or as you read in my book, how do you take something like that and work it
Yeah.
into a novel? And well, the way I did it was the aliens who
Hmm.
uh, the Deganians, I believe that's what I call my aliens, the
Hmm.
Deganians who were looking at Earth from afar, trying to find their lost princess, saw the Craig colony and thought it was a prison camp.
Hmm.
And since holding their princess in a prison camp was an act of war,
Hmm.
and it would be an act of war under the Hague Convention
Sure.
here on Earth, they let loose their uh,
Yep. We're going to send our armada and we're going to rescue our princess. And yeah.
armada, the armada.
things are going to get blown up.
So that's how I worked this horrible Craig colony into the plot of this, I think somewhat fun novel.
Yeah. And the princess ends up in the Craig colony because she has epilepsy. And she
Yes.
has epilepsy due to this transference protocol. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That seemed to work out fairly well.
It took me a while to weave all of the elements together, but I think by the time I was done, I weaved them all together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't have. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say another example of where I took an actual historical event and turned it into a fictional, interesting event was Jack Dempsey. You know how Mike Kelly dreams that he's going to spar with Jack Dempsey and be so successful that Dempsey will somehow take him on and he'll be Dempsey's protege. Well, I got that idea because apparently back in the 20s and 30s, one of the ways that heavyweight fighters, when they were training for a big championship bout, they would travel around some of the resorts and put on exhibitions at different hotels. And it just so happens that, so I'm reading about this area, I'm researching this area, and I see that Jack Dempsey is going to, or actually did a demonstration of his skills in August of the same year that the book was set. So
very cool.
I thought, so the actual hotel that I mentioned in the novel where the Kelly Dempsey bout is set, and the day in the calendar, I believe it was August 13th, all of that in Saratoga, New York, actually occurred. The only thing I added to it was the person that Dempsey sparred with was Mike Kelly, my fictional character.
Okay.
But I did that with the second book too, and I'm doing it with the third book too, where you do enough legal research and you come up with enough historical oddities, and then you weave your character through those historical oddities or interesting points of history, and you got yourself a book.
Cool. So I'm revealing my ignorance with regard to boxing history. Was Jack Dempsey a Mormon?
Jack Dempsey was a Mormon, and what's also interesting, at least from my own personal life, is this little town in Colorado where I live. Jack Dempsey once, when he was 18 years old, before he was the Jack Dempsey, he he fought in a bar here in this little town in Colorado, and there's a big, huge mural painted on the side of the bar here on Main Street. So that was when I walked by it almost every day, and that's when I thought. And I read that about that he had boxed in Saratoga when he was preparing for one of his big heavyweight title fights. And then I thought, wow, I gotta somehow weave Dempsey into this book. And yes, he was a Mormon. That goes to the whole theme of the book, and the title of the book. It gives you strength. Because the beer that they all drink at the boxing match, they're told gives them strength.
Oh, yeah, Guinness.
Guinness, it gives you strength, which was the true motto of the Guinness Brewing Company for decades. Guinness, it gives you strength. And Guinness actually marketed beer to the Irish and to Americans. That wasn't, they were actually much in the way that we had cigarette companies telling Americans that cool cigarettes were favored by doctors. Well, the Guinness Brewing Company in England told the Irish and told Americans, and many of them Irish Americans, that Guinness gave them strength, and that a different brand of Guinness, a heavier brand of Guinness stout, would help women's lactation when they gave birth.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so that's why in that first time when they're at the carnival and they first have the boxing, they're serving the Guinness, and Guinness gives you strength. But there's other characters in the book who draw strength from other things. There's Father O'Brien draws strength from God. There's Tosh and Zoe, the aliens, draw strength from their technology. Obviously, the Irish draw strength from, or think they draw strength from, Guinness.
Yeah, the vitamins.
Yes, the vitamins in Guinness.
Yeah, that whole scene with the vitamins, it went in a completely different direction. I was not expecting that. I was expecting the bottle of vitamins to be like some kind of drug or sleeping pill.
That's one of my favorite scenes. And you know what's funny was that. So I said that we did a book release party at the Apple Orchard in upstate New York, and when the owner of the orchard introduced me, he said, I've read this book and I think I figured it out. Mr. Brown has been struggling with alcohol his whole life, and he wrote this book. And everybody relatives of mine know that I've been like a teetotaler my whole life, and they all started laughing. He had no idea why they were laughing, and then I patted him on the back and I said, "That's a really interesting theory," And
yeah, well, it wasn't something I expected, but if it had been the case, it would have tracked a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the characters a little bit. We've talked quite a bit about Mike Kelly, and he seems like a fairly straightforward guy. He just he suffers from hubris every so often, and the fact that he thinks he can. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, even when his first entrance into the book, when it's 4th of July and they're shooting off fireworks, it's Memorial Day weekend and they're shooting off fireworks, and he rides in on his horse in his dress uniform with his Medal of Honor wrapped around his neck. And I say, it takes a very special ego for anyone to ride a horse in with fireworks above, wearing a Medal of Honor, and Mike Kelly is that has that ego. He to be a hero in a military battle, and I definitely it makes you wonder: is there a lot of? It takes a lot of hubris to be heroic. I'm going to live through whatever this is, and if I don't, I'm. Everyone will be better for it. And he definitely has that personality. My son, who just read the book, my son is a teenager, and he actually is a boxer. And although I've made him promise me he'll never actually fight in a match where he can actually get punched in the head, he just trains. And when he read that section on Kelly and Dempsey, he said, "Kelly's an idiot. He trained for 3 months and he thought he was going to box with Jack Dempsey." and I said, "Well, he's got a lot of confidence. There's no doubt about it."
Yeah, there's a fine line between hubris and moxie, and I think he kind of crossed it a couple of times there. But he does enter the scene with a lot of confidence and a lot of arrogance. And it's obviously bolstered up by his status within the community. But also, as the book progresses, he changes a lot. And it's not just as a result of his relationship with Tasha and Joe, but also he stops drinking, which changes him for the better.
A recommendation I would make to anyone. It's just a healthier lifestyle.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Tosh and Joe, because he's the protagonist at the beginning. I think Mike Kelly sort of turns into the protagonist near the end. But Tosh and Joe, he's the narrator, and he's an alien, and he's an anthropologist.
I struggled with my narrator. And this book could have been written and some people said it to me, it should have been written that the narrator could be, how many historical fiction novels do you read where there's an alien? Not a lot. And some of the readers who I'd given it to in advance were, Phil, don't have an alien narrator. Have the narrator be a undercover police officer. I mean, it could have been a child. There's all sorts of literary devices that you could use to make the same points that I wanted to make. I thought that the narrator had to be someone who had very little knowledge of America, of prohibition, and in order to say the things about prohibition and America that I wanted to say in the novel, it had to be someone who Mike Kelly would take under his wing and would start telling them. And that's how I came up with the boxing, the
skirmish. Tasha Joe being a skirmisher.
The skirmishing, the boxing, yes, and that's why Kelly wanted to learn so quickly, and his dream of fighting, or of sparring with Jack Dempsey. It all blended together, and the aliens looking down on Earth and seeing the prison camp, and it turns out to be the Craig colony. The reason when they're on the Canadian border and Kelly's showing Tashinzo around and telling about all the history of smuggling in from Canada, and they meet up with the IRS agents, the revenue agents they were called then, and none of them had ever heard of the Craig colony. I did that on purpose because, I grew up in upstate New York. I went to college probably 85 miles from where the Craig colony was. I had friends from Rochester, New York, which is probably 40 miles from where the Craig colony was. When I actually contacted them and said, "What do you guys know about the Craig colony?" None of them ever even heard of it. I had never heard of it. So it's not just a secret that that we, now I'm in Colorado. Of course, people in Colorado haven't heard of it, but even the people who lived up there haven't heard of the Craig colony. And it wasn't that, as I said, they closed it in 1968. So bringing this back to your question about Tashinzo, I chose the alien because it had to be someone who was open to learning all about the Earth, America. And I chose the anthropologist because an anthropologist would be really interested in learning about the culture and about America, but would also understand that he can't use any of his knowledge or power to influence it. And that's the problem that Tashinzo has, in that he's been sent to rescue the princess, yet he can't use any of his, advanced technology.
Yeah, he has to rely on his skills as an anthropologist.
Yes.
And the fact that he's open, or at least has a concept of some sort of multicultural existence or multicultural way of how things are, and is flagrantly and opposed to the militaristic intervention that supposedly that's going to take place to rescue the princess and level the planet. Yeah, that was a really interesting inclusion. Yeah, not what you'd normally expect, and that I thought it provided a really interesting perspective on how things would go, or how things did go. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but there are a few moralistic glances that you cast, and they're cast sideways. I never suspected that you would like. I never got a hint of you getting on a soapbox or anything like that. But there are a couple of things like alcohol being bad and the questionable practices or medical practices early in the 20th century. Now, how did you go about talking about those or writing about them without coming across as preachy or soapboxing?
Well, because I don't believe people should drink alcohol, but
Mm-hmm.
I think the worst possible way to convince people not to drink alcohol is to have the government pass a law telling people they can't
Yeah.
drink alcohol. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same with um, drugs. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think people should put drugs in their body, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't want the government to pass laws telling people
Mm-hmm.
you can't put drugs in their body, because then people want to put drugs in their body. The worst
Sure.
thing you can do to Americans is tell them they can't do something, because then,
Right.
and that's what I try to show through Mike Kelly too. The
Yeah.
worst thing you can do with Mike Kelly is tell him he can't do something, because then he's
Yeah.
gonna do it. Um, about the medical profession, um, I think probably because I'm married to a really fine doctor, I understand how, she goes to work every day and comes home exhausted every night,
Mm-hmm.
and she's just doing her best. Um, and I read so much about the founder of the Craig Colony. I believe his name was William Peterson,
Mm-hmm.
and he not only was he did found the Craig Colony, but after that he went on to have a huge psychiatric practice in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And his family, he actually has a Wikipedia page, but they never
Mm-hmm.
mentioned the Craig Colony.
Oh.
Um, and he was an art collector, and was apparently a such a excellent poet
Mm-hmm.
that he wrote Chinese poetry,
No
and
kidding.
people in China didn't even realize that it was an American writing this
Mm-hmm.
poetry that became so popular. So he was a
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, complex man.
Mm-hmm.
They just oversold
Mm-hmm.
the benefits of putting people in this colony,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think they did it on purpose. But
Mm-hmm.
I think, like so many, and I don't mean to sound like I'm bashing, well-intentioned government
Right.
programs, but
Sure.
like so many, I think by the mid 40s, people understood that you could control seizures to a large degree using medication.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they had all these people in this camp. They called it the colony, using the colony care program. The
Mm-hmm.
colony care program was you work really hard,
Mm-hmm.
and and that was just not the way that seizures are now controlled in America.
Mm-hmm.
There's very fine medications that people take, and so I didn't mean to be judgy I
Right.
didn't intend to be judgy, and I don't think you
Mm-hmm.
should judge those people. There
Mm-hmm.
was
Oh yeah.
one gentleman, I believe in 1937, who gave a speech in Virginia about how evil the people with epilepsy were. I think we should judge that guy, but I can't even
Yeah.
tell
Yeah.
you his name.
Sure.
I couldn't think of a way to
Mm-hmm.
weave him into the book. He was like our
Yeah.
version of Hitler. Um,
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is these methods of treating epileptic patients. I think the doctors did have the best of intentions then. At least that's how it all seems. And so what's interesting about it is, okay, how did they get to this point? How did they figure out, or how did they decide that these were good treatments? And this whole idea of working really hard is a fairly common thing in the early 20th century in with self-help books. And I'm thinking of like Dale Carnegie's books, which were written, I think, maybe 10 years later. And a hallmark trait of his, okay, if you're worried, if you're upset, just focus on something and keep yourself busy. And then you're not going to think about why you're so miserable,
and
which
and
there's something to be said for that. But
And Peterson actually went on a European tour of before they founded the Craig colony, and he researched the facilities in Europe that they thought had the most success. And then when he created the Craig colony, he was trying to replicate those facilities that he thought were most humane and successful. He wasn't creating, just a work camp. The problem was that eventually the legislature got tired. The New York legislature got tired of appropriating money and wanted to try to make them cost efficient. Anyways.
I'm a little surprised they weren't cost efficient because there's so much free labor there, but apparently they weren't. So yeah, that's how it goes. Which you've already mentioned a couple of the parts that you really enjoyed working on in the book. Maybe talk about a couple other parts of the book that you really enjoyed working on, or parts that you're particularly proud of.
All right, I'm very proud of the the boxing match between Dempsey and Mike Kelly, and in fact, in the second book, Harvesting Earthlings, the second book is called Harvesting Earthlings for Fun and Profit.
Oh, that sounds fun! Yeah,
so let me just talk about that for a second, and then I'll tell you why. Okay, sure. Harvesting Earthlings, the first book, as you know, was set mostly in upstate New York. And there is some science fiction elements in the beginning and the end. And then the fact that the alien is on Earth interacting, but one of the things I wanted to do in the second book was spend more time on the alien's home planet. And so what I did was, I created a whole political structure, and the political structure and the dictator of the planet that the alien is from wants to try to keep the attention of the people that he is, and much like Caesar with his bread and circuses, the dictator starts taking beings from different planets. And he has a arena, and it's much. I borrow much from the Romans, and then he creates a television show where, their version of a television show where the Deganians, the aliens, can travel to Earth to win valuable prizes by harvesting Earthlings and bringing them back. And I think it's funny. I find it quite funny. So why did I bring the second book up? It's because one person who reviewed it said they never knew Jack Dempsey was a space traveler, because Jack Dempsey comes back in the second book. Mike Kelly comes back in the second book, and Tosh and Zoe comes back in the second book. And it was very interesting to me what the first book takes place during Prohibition. The second book takes place during the Great Depression, which follows basically 7 years after the Prohibition. I then have the Great Depression, and there's a whole new host of actual gangsters that I can draw upon, so that I can continue with the exact same formula from the first book into the second book. And my third book that I'm now currently working on, I don't even have a title yet for, but it's 7 years from the second book, and it's set in New York and in Nazi Germany, because it's set in 1943. Oh, okay.
So pivoting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, pivoting a good bit on the geographical location, but it looks like there's an historical progression at least.
There is, and I think this is the end of. I'm calling this the end of my trilogy, and then I'm going to move on to different characters.
Okay, cool. So do we see Mike Kelly and Tosh and Joe in the third book as well, or not?
We do, and Yes. I don't think there's many more characters from the first or second book that's going to appear in the third book, because I'm trying to write
Mhm.
the third one as a standalone novel. But
Mhm.
Kelly and so far Tashinzo has not revealed himself, but someone that they believe to be Tashinzo is in the third book so far.
Okay, in the mix. Okay, so Harvesting Earthlings for Fun and Profit is released right now, and you're working on the third book.
Yes, in fact,
Cool.
Harvesting Earthlings
Oh,
for
there we
fun
go.
and profit.
Okay. So a couple of things I really liked, or a couple of moments that stayed with me. The entire event on Lake Champlain, which we've talked about already, but that was both wonderfully written and just hilarious, I thought, on so many levels. It's
Thank
like
you.
Mike Kelly just comes in and said, "Yep, I am the head of the whatever it was, the Naval Auxiliary Corps." I'm saying that's not the right title, but he
New
just
York
comes in
Naval
with
Militia.
right.
The New York
Yeah,
Naval Militia.
he
Yes.
just comes in with utter confidence and says, "Oh, we're going to do some training exercises here." And my reaction is, what military value would Lake Champlain be at this point? And probably
Right.
not a whole lot, but as you mentioned, they're training sailors, so that makes a lot more sense. It'd be a great place to train and do other things as well, apparently.
Well, and they're still. I mean, that's the other thing that I mean. So this book is set in the mid 1920s, but
Mhm.
even today, you can Google the New York Naval Militia, and to this day, in 2024, there's a New
Mhm.
York Naval Militia, and on their website it says that they are leading the fight to keep terrorists from entering through Canada.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
All
And
right.
oh,
Well,
is that why they're spending the money?
yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know the details or the logistics of that, but I find it a little bit surprising.
Oh, could I mention another? You asked me about historical um, uh, things that I wrote
Hmm.
about. Another thing that actually completely exists, I wrote about how the Whitehall Armory, how
Hmm.
they not only did boxing matches there,
Hmm.
but then they stole weapons from the Whitehall Armory,
Oh yeah, they had
and
all
that
the artillery. Yeah.
it looked like a European castle,
Hmm.
and that it was also a government program that took place after the Civil War. It was decided we have all these weapons that have been built and we have to house them. So
Hmm.
someone in their infinite wisdom in New York decided, not just in Whitehall, but all across New York State, they would build European castles. And inside those castles, they would house, military grade weapons for the next time. And so then they put their World War I era
Yeah.
weapons in the armories.
Uh-huh.
And so I grew up right near the Whitehall Armory.
Hmm.
And later, when they decided, maybe housing all these weapons in inside these armories isn't the smartest thing. So at one point, when they'd cleared out a lot of the weapons, but they still were trying to make it profitable, they were holding professional wrestling.
Hmm.
Um, uh, you could go buy tickets and go watch Hulk
Hmm.
Hogan at the
Hmm.
Whitehall Armory fighting
Hmm.
Macho Man Randy Savage or whomever, right? And
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 it's all a
that's
cover
how
for
I
hiding howitzers, right?
exactly, and that's how I got the idea that um, Mike Kelly and his men could practice boxing in the Whitehall Armory,
Okay. Okay.
and it would be their hideout where they would, also when they needed weapons, they would borrow weapons from the Whitehall Armory. But it
Hmm.
literally exists. The Whitehall Armory it's a beautiful, giant castle. It was actually sold just a couple of years ago for $500,000. And
Hmm.
if you're interested, there's other castles in upstate New York they're trying to sell.
Hmm.
Um, and it's another example of perhaps they could have found a more basic building style
Yeah, maybe
that
a
could
little
have been
less. Yeah,
ostentatious.
yeah, a little less flamboyant, a little less noticeable, a little less inviting of people. Oh, hey, there's a cool castle. Let's check it out. Howitzer. Like they have 75 millimeter howitzers in a castle. Just aesthetically, it strikes me as funny and
Yes,
kind of
exactly.
poetic in a way.
Exactly.
So your first two books and possibly your third, are you self-published or are you through an independent publisher?
I'm self-published,
Okay.
but um, nowadays there's a hybrid form where
Hmm.
you can have like the first book, It Gives You Strength, was let me get their name correctly. I had Canoe Tree Press, which
Hmm.
is a hybrid publisher, which is basically they uh, uh, put all of the elements of the book. You draft the manuscript.
Hmm.
They put all the elements of the book together. They tell you all the things you need to do to put the book together.
Hmm.
They put it on Amazon and Apple and all the places for you,
Hmm.
and then your book is out there, and you pay them a fee. That's
Okay.
a hybrid publisher.
Okay.
Um, the second book, after watching um, Canoe Tree do what they did for me to publish the first book, the second book I did everything myself.
Hmm.
So that's that.
Okay. Yeah. The podcast is primarily geared toward people like yourself who have self-published or gone through an independent publisher. What advice would you give people who have a manuscript in the works and are looking to move it into the public sphere?
Okay. Well, it is much like anything else, whether it's weight loss or any. You take baby steps. What I tell anybody who wants to know about publishing a book, writing a book, let's
Hmm.
start with writing a book, is you want 10 pages a chapter, 30 chapters a book.
Hmm.
So deal with writing a chapter at a time.
Hmm.
Go from Neil Gaiman, the great science fiction writer, says that writing your first draft, the writer is telling himself the story.
Hmm.
And I totally remind myself that almost every day while I'm writing is I've
Hmm.
got to get through 10 pages
Hmm.
and oh my God, I'm telling myself the story. And it doesn't matter that I'm off on a sidetrack because
Hmm.
that sidetrack might end up being my story.
Hmm.
And I get through 10 pages and that's the end of that chapter. And now I move on to the next chapter. And it's baby steps. And those 10 uh, pages with 30 chapters turns out to be 300 pages and a novel.
Hmm.
That's and that's then you edit it, and your first draft becomes your second draft. Your second draft becomes your third draft,
Hmm.
and then you have your novel.
Hmm. So, did you have editors or
I
proofreaders, or did you do that yourself?
I on the first book I hired 3 editors. I
Hmm.
had them at different stages of the process.
Oh, good
Um,
idea. Hmm.
yeah, and there's a and that's important because the first editor will just look at your story and tell you what you're doing right or wrong and what sounds good, what doesn't sound good, whether
Hmm.
something is just bizarre. The second editor will actually you could have them look at the grammar and then my third editor I wasn't I believe it's called the line editor, was mostly
Hmm.
like the proofreading and making sure I
Okay.
had everything perfect. And then, um, and there's some hybrid publishers, if you're going to go through them, they'll have in-house editors who will do the work for you. But
Hmm.
again, my first book, I was just flying by the seat of my pants. I hadn't decided
Hmm.
I was going. to how I was going to publish it. They, when I was finished with the first book, It Gives You Strength, it was the middle of COVID. I sent out letters to different publishers to do what they call traditional publishing, right? To see if anyone was interested. And I heard from a bunch of people that said, everybody in New York is shut down. We're all shut down. You have a really cool sounding story, but everything's shut down. And I could have waited till everything came back to life, but I didn't know how long it was going to be. And I'm not the youngest person in the world. And I wanted to get on with my second book and my third book and whatever. So I just, it's easy. You publish it yourself. Once everything's on Amazon, something like 85% of the books in America are sold on Amazon anyways, whether they're published traditionally or hybrid.
So, I suppose if you're willing to do all the marketing and do a lot of the formatting yourself, it seems like a pretty good direction to go with self-publishing, because then you're not subjected, at least what a lot of other people have said, you're not subjected to the market as much, because my understanding is that a lot of traditional publishers will say, oh, we published maybe 3 books like this already this year, so we're not going to take yours. And it doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the book, but just with how they see their market.
And I don't know this to be true, but what I heard was it takes a long time for the traditional publishing process to go from their acceptance of a book to all of the rewrites to the finished published book. And I wasn't willing to wait a long time. I wanted to get this process underway, and I'm happy with the result.
Yeah. Well, I thought it looked very polished. And
thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to ask before we go, one more thing. The cover. Did you do the cover yourself, or did you outsource that?
Gosh, I wish I could think of the name. There's a website, and I'm gonna try to find the name because it's important. It was done by a professional designer, Ricardo Montano Castro. He's from, I believe, Bogota, Colombia. But met, and he did, and I'll show you. Here's the cover of the second book, and it's much like the cover of the first book.
Yeah, the main character, and there looks pretty similar.
Yeah, and you'll see in the second book, he's holding a Tommy gun, and he's in Washington, D.C. because much of the action takes place in Washington, D.C. by the Capitol. So, but there's a website that I'm not going to remember the name of it, but what it is you put in all the information about your book that they ask for, and then they have designers from all around the world compete. And it's quite amazing because
that's
I
pretty
think
cool.
I had about 150 entries, and there were probably 10 that I would have found acceptable for the cover of my book, but I selected the ones Ricardo did, and it only ended up costing me about $300 or $400.
Oh, that doesn't sound bad at all. Yeah.
No, it was really a joy, and I had it done when I was probably finishing my first draft. So I knew the elements of the book, but I was tired and I just needed kind of a jolt, right? And so the weekend where they did the book cover, and then all those entries came in and I could see my actual book taking life, was a really good thing to have happen.
Yeah. I can imagine that giving you like a second or even a third wind at that point.
Exactly. That's exactly the way it felt. And I should write down the name of the website because I would recommend them to anyone, and I'm not going to remember. Okay. But I know Ricardo Montano Castro won. He won the second time too, so he did both book covers. I used the same service both times.
Yeah. Well, having stylistic consistency, especially with a trilogy, the way you're doing it right now, I think would be a major draw.
Yeah, I'm pleased. I think the third one will look the same, but we'll see.
Mhm. Cool. So when can we expect the third book?
I'm hoping by Christmas of 2024, but I'm
Okay.
not certain.
Things like that are rarely set in stone, are they? Yeah. Well, until then, everyone has It Gives You Strength and Harvesting Humans for Fun and Profit to keep us busy until then. Okay. Wonderful. Phil, it's been wonderful having you. Thank you so much for joining me today on
This has been a pleasure.
Great. Yeah. What, at least in Connecticut, is a fairly nice day. I hope it's the same out in Colorado for you.
It is. Thank you.
Okay, great. And we'll talk to you soon. All right. Have a good day.
You have a nice day as well. Bye-bye.